The One Piece trading card game kicked off the OP14 format with not one, not two, not three, but 4 major championships this weekend in Asia, especially with the brand new decks coming in the format and also good cards just in general getting added to older decks. A lot of people are excited about this format to see what this meta looks like, especially if you watched my tier list video last week. I'm going to be showing you a ton of decks from these championships that I have found. So especially for those of you practicing for nationals out in North America, EU, I'm sorry. But before we get into that, let's hear more from our sponsor. The holidays have officially hit at Nen Garden, and they're following up their Black Friday with a huge sale continuing. If you go ahead right now and buy any 2 playmats on their website, you can get the Sun God playmat for $9.99, which is basically a steal when we're talking about playmats, right? They've also got a special deal on their pins where if you buy 2 of them, you get a third one for 50% off. So not only do you get these incredible deals, but my affiliate code actually stacks on top of it to save you even more money this holiday season. Spread the holiday cheer by using code Atrocious at checkout for 10% off your order on these already great deals. The link to Nen Garden's website will be in the description below, and thank you so much for supporting one of our great friends here in the community. Happy holidays to you, and let's get back into the video. So all these deck lists are going to have copy-paste capabilities into the OPTCG simulator over on Eggman's website. For those of you who do not know, I manually input all of these deck lists in Eggman's website. Every single one of these, at least on the OP14 page, I put in. If you want to go check it out for yourself, maybe see some of the deck lists that I don't showcase, because there's like 90 to 100 deck lists in here right now. Like, I'm not going to show them all. I'll leave the link in the description below. First, let's talk about existing decks, and we'll go over Ace quickly. Ace didn't really gain anything, and there's not much changes that are actually made, but we saw in the winning list from the Saturday night to Sunday Japan Championship, the second Tokyo Championship, if you watched that on the channel, the deck list changed a little bit, right? Running the 6-cost Rush Yamato from EBO2. Now, I know some Western players are currently playing it in OP13, but especially out in the East, this was used very early on in the OP13 format and then fell off, especially if you need to get into a more aggressive state, which honestly some of these game plans and new leaders do force. Then Yamato is a nice one to be able to play on like 6 or 7. It's kind of that weird turn where you don't necessarily need to play Jozu, but it's too early to play something like the I Am Whitebeard event and one of your Newgates. Speaking of Newgate, we also saw the reintroduction of Taxbeard. I feel like very similarly, right? We saw Taxbeard very prevalent, 2 copies in every single deck list at the beginning of the OP13 format, but fell off more and more as we got later and later. If anything, it was just a 1 in a lot of people's lists, especially with some decks being able to swarm the board very fast. Newgate gets a little bit more value that's not just Emu, in my opinion. Other than that, though, pretty standard lists. I feel like also something that happened is people were playing more Gum Red Hawk than usual. I feel like a lot of times in the OP13 format we saw like 2 Red Rocks pretty much at most, but this list playing 3 of them. And if you look towards a lot of these ace lists that I have here on this page, there are a lot of people playing 3, 4. So if you locked in Ace in the OP13 format and you want to play this out as long as possible, you're pretty set right now. Now, although a lot of people might say, oh, Emu is dead, whatever, Emu is definitely not dead and is still a prevalent deck, even though it wasn't the most dominant deck, in my opinion, in the opening weekend of OP14, right? In the first Tokyo CS, we saw 3 within the top 16, and we still had another appearance on the second Tokyo CS, even if it was only 1. And we also have this list, which is the top 8 list from Washina in the Hong Kong 1v1. It's pretty much what I've been telling you guys. The introduction to Ground Death is just a staple card within this deck, right? Being able to negate a 5 cost or less, or be in the late game a plus 4,000 power event really makes it dangerous, because now Emu can have up to 8 plus 4,000 power events. In terms of the other spots, right, some of the ratios that really change, we've seen that Shirahoshi and Saint Josgard, or however you say it, I really don't know. Somebody tell me how to say this in the comments. Are your 2K package that you typically go with within this deck. Most all decks I've seen in the OP14 format don't play Charlos anymore, right? That 2-drop blocker. And especially your Shirahoshi and Josgard count, like one of them is either 2 or 3 and the other one is 4. Brown Death most often than not is a full 4 copies, but Ashina playing 3. And also, instead of the Equilibrium event, they're playing after all these years I'm losing my edge. Now, we saw this card run some prevalency in the beginning of the OP13 format with former world champion Guan Rong playing this card, and I do like this card. I've talked about it on the live streams and I've talked about it in different videos. Being able on this 1 cost event to go plus 1000 power and then grab anything 3 or less because you probably fill the trash requirement, which is more often than not a 2K, so it's basically a flexible 3000 power counter event. It can also just be nice in certain stages of the game to be able to get Saint Shalria, right? Reutilize that searcher card. I mean, I have nothing more to say about this deck list. It's pretty much the same. And Emu is still a good deck. One that made a ton of noise is Fidelio TCG's top 4 finish in the second Tokyo CS. If this list looks familiar to you, this I think is like 1 card off of the list that we showcased last week when he topped his flagship with Bonnie. Some of the cards that are big additions into this deck are Perona, right? We even saw this Perona showcased in the stream game and how its value can be applied. Being able to negate 2 5 costs or less from being rested is not only blockers, but on top of that, also potentially attacks. This is a very good card to be able to slow down the game plan and be able as well to play out a 5 cost green character, which is so much of your deck, right? As we talked about when Bonnie won that Japan championship in 13 playing the Lon Beppo, it still applies in this beginning stages of the OP14 format, right? We'll talk about it later, and you probably already know if you watched some of my earlier videos last week that Dracule Mihawks are also playing this card. Just being a 7,000 power leader has so many advantages. But outside of that, I'll leave Fidelio to do most of the talking in terms of this list. I know he did a live stream recently where he did a breakdown of the deck list, his matchups, and also the tournament game that he played. So I highly encourage that you check it out. I really enjoyed his input and thoughts on that. Really helped me understand like some of his decisions and especially what you do in the Boa matchup, because holy moly, I feel like Boa is a little tough to play against. And speaking of Boa Hancock, why don't we just go ahead and start talking about Boa Hancock? Now, in terms of the opening weeks, there are a couple different ways to stylize this deck, but I really enjoyed this version that got 2nd place in the Tokyo Japan Championships. The most surprising thing that I saw with this list comparatively to all the other lists is a full 4 copies, a whole playset of You'll Frighten Me. And especially in that stream game versus Fidelio in the top 4 of that championship, we saw how powerful this card can be within the end game. Being able in general to prevent an active character from attacking for an entire turn means that when your opponent is going in for lethal, if you have a Dawn up, you can basically negate an entire swing. Although this card doesn't give you any counter and is also pretty much a brick in hand otherwise, especially if you're not at 2 or less life, this card is definitely super dangerous in my opinion, and is definitely one that I think when you're going for the end game against a Boa, you have to think about, especially because they play other 1 cost events like Slave Arrow. When they leave 1 Dawn up, you have no idea if that 1 Dawn is a Slave Arrow or a You'll Frighten Me, and it really causes you to play the game differently. We also saw how much of a powerhouse and a staple that this Boa Hancock is, right? Being able on a 4 Dawn turn to look at that top 3 and set up your Kuma plays going on to 6 is actually a huge deal, right? Especially when the most important trigger, I think, in this deck, the Gorgon Sisters, is within that top 3 and you can manipulate it to put it in your life off the Kuma. We essentially saw Boas throughout the weekend kind of live and die by this card, right? Game plans looked pretty bleak until this ended up getting on the field from a trigger, and if you were able to set it up properly, it did wild wonders to your game plan, right? Being able every single turn to be able to reveal several cards and put a Dawn everywhere, that's up to 6 rested Dawn, especially because there's no restrictions on what Dawn you can attach to certain characters. So it could be any character. It can be a Kuja Pirates character like Boa Hancock. It can be a 7 Warlords of the Sea kind of character like Kuma. We also saw through the couple championships that Marguerite was a pretty good card to be able to play. Marguerite, although I feel like in the early stages of the week, was not very common in a lot of different lists, right? Favoring stuff like Sengoku, which is a good card, don't get me wrong, or maybe Gloriosa. Marguerite was just really nice to be able to play off of something like Trigger to look through your deck and be able to accelerate the game plan, even though you have to trash another card from hand. This deck is full of a ton of other trigger bodies as well, right? Ran being a good trigger body and also just another good forward-on play. I think Boa Hancock, right, the blocker is probably your best forward-on play, but this one in Ran is not that bad, to be honest. Still being able to get it done on your leader for your potential leader effect. You also had Shakuyaku, which, although is a 2K and more often than not is going to be used as a 2K, is still a 5,000 power body, can swing into most of the meta. A 6,000 power body essentially when the Gorgon sisters are already involved. You've got the 3-cost Boa Hancock, which is the old blocker from starter deck 3, and then Kiku no Jo added to this list specifically, not something that we see a ton of in these Boa lists, but again, this did get second place at the Japan Championship, and especially with that trigger of 3 or less life, play the card, that being the opponent, can be a really nice endgame kind of card. One thing that I also found very interesting about Boa Hancock is that it was very difficult to play against, right? If you're not necessarily a bottom decking or bouncing back to hand style kind of deck, it's really tough to be able to swing into Boa, right? Because of all the play trigger bodies that we mentioned, and there's even some other cards that play a character, right? You'll Frighten Me does one. Boa Hancock, the 9-cost plays one. So you always have to hold your breath when you're swinging at life that, oh gosh, I hope they don't trigger body. I hope they don't trigger body. And then when the bodies do come out onto the field, you can't really battle them until the end of the game, right? Because they can consistently get a Dawn on their leader, KOing a body like Marguerite in the battle means that you've got to take a life, right? Because any 5,000 base power is KO. You have to take that life, which is literally almost everything in the deck except this Boa in terms of all the bodies that get played down. So before you do really any battling board control, you have to get down to 0, right? Or maybe be comfortable being at 0 or low numbers. And especially with this 9-cost Boa being able to basically burn a life or force you to take a life with that on play effect, you see a lot of people guard early, right? To be able to hold. We even have heard some people and content creators talk about how in OP14, you need to try not to go any lower than 2 life, right? As soon as you hit 2 life, that's kind of the boom game plan for Boa Hancock, especially with these 9-cost characters out on the field. And by the way, they have an unblockable in Perfume Femur. I think this deck is super dangerous. And even though I think a lot of you are just going to say like, oh, it's a trigger deck, blah, 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 yellow. It is just, it's so much more than that. It is such, this leader effect is so difficult to play against. I'm going to backtrack a smidge to the old decks just to talk about UP Luffy real quick. This ended up winning the first Japan Championships out in Tokyo, and nothing much really has changed. I think the biggest thing that has changed really is the reintroduction of Dracule Mihawk, right? The 9-cost Dracule Mihawk leaving the deck a little bit just simply because of Emu, right? Favoring things like Douglas Bullet instead because, well, you don't have removal potential. Now this Mihawk comes in with Emu on the down low or not as popular, being an effective target to a lot of these different characters that we're going to see in these deck lists that we've already seen in these deck lists. Your game plan is still ramp to Roger, right? Not too surprising, I think, to a lot of people. And the more often that you can get Roger, the better off you are in the game, as we saw in the championships. But yeah, not too much different with this deck, in my opinion. We also saw UP Sanji make it within the top 16, which I was actually super excited about. And yes, I did confirm that they were playing Sanji within the top 16. And though there was a little bit of controversy with their tweet that they made, people were confused and thought that they played UP Luffy. But I think what they were explaining was that in the top 16 round, they played against the UP Luffy that ended up winning the championship. In their tweet, they accidentally said that it was UP Sanji mirror match. But anyways, UP Sanji not necessarily getting anything in OP14, but really showcasing the EB03 Reiju in this deck, right? With that your turn on play, Dawn -1, if your leader is Sanji, activate the main effect of one of your event cards of 7 or less from your trash. Any one of these event cards that has a main that you can use on the main phase can now be used for just a Dawn -1. It makes it super strong and super flexible within the deck. And one of the things that I thought was very curious in this deck is none of the OP12 blocker Reijus, right? The one that gains cost and power based on the events in your trash. Just going in with this with these 2Ks that you play outright as Kaya and Otama to find your pieces, build up your trash for your 3 cost not removable Sanjis, makes Jozu a perfect candidate, right? And especially in stuff like the Ace matchup, Jozu is very nice because you can remove Ace's targets off the field. Whereas most all of your targets like Sanji, you can't really remove, and wow, if they want to move this back into your hand with a Jozu, now you threaten the ability to play this back down on the field, and once again, Red Rock their Edward Newgate. I love the idea of this deck being a little bit more meta, especially after falling off a bit in OP13, and I definitely think we'll see Sanji in another top cut before the end of the season. This deck, man, I can't wait to try out this deck again, especially with EB03. I have to wait until February though because of this freaking Reiju. I love this deck. I still love that video that I made about the deck. Speaking of decks that maybe will have you wait until EB03 to play, Vivy had a top 32 appearance in one of the Japan championships, right? Got an invite to nationals. In order to get top 32 within these championships, you at least have to have a 7-2 record, and if you're 7-2, you better have really high resistance. So if you're 8-1, you lock in. 7-2, you have to lose late. I think this Vivy ended up being 7-2, but started out 7-0 within the tournament, then fell in the last 2 rounds. Right, once again, similar to UP Sanji, not necessarily getting anything in OP14, but I want to talk about this Igaram card that is in the Vivy deck that I really haven't seen, and I had to look up to know what this card was, not only when I was inputting it on the website, but also just trying to think like, what the heck is this? Igaram has an activate main of resting the character and giving your leader minus 5,000 power during the turn. And if you do, you can look up to the top 5 cards of your deck for an Alabasta type, add it to your hand. Since you're running 24 different Alabasta cards, there are so many targets that you can utilize within this deck. The Searcher Vivy, right, is one. Another Searcher within the deck. The EB03 Vivy, which plays out a 5-cost Straw Hat Crew or Alabasta type card from your hand. You can find a 2K in the Nefeltari Cobra. You can also find the Alabasta Nami, which is an important card and great synergy in EB03 with the Vivy. But also you can find your counter event, right? Which 4K counter event, so good. Especially giving minus 5,000 power to your leader is literally nothing when you're going to use this activate main of resting the leader anyways to be able to give something like this Nami Rush. I think this card is really, really cool in the deck. It's a way to get another set of searchers within this to help make your deck even more consistent. Even if all your main cards, right, like the Ben Beckman, like the Silvers Rayleigh, the Kaido, the Shanks are not searchable. Even though Vivy didn't have a top in the OP13 format, unfortunately, that we saw in the Japan Championships, it was nice to see it at least make the top 32, and maybe we'll build off of this in the future in 14. Okay, I promise I'll get to the new deck soon, right? Let me talk about Zoro Sanji. I love this leader, this being the Fishman style of the deck, right? East Blue, as we've traditionally seen within this deck for the last couple sets, did have a couple interesting changes, right? Ace being one of them. The secret rare Ace, if you do not know, not only can have Rush if you have 3 or less life cards, but is another 7,000 power body to be able to restand. The one thing about Zoro Sanji that a lot of people can maybe attest to is that when you're facing against a removal deck and they're very good at at removing your bodies on the field and bodies that you don't have the ability to restand. The only way that you can utilize your leader effect to be able to get some big pressure and swings off is a rush body, which is not very prevalent within this deck. Ace, though, is a really nice rush body because as a 4 life leader, you're probably very quickly in the early stages of the game at 3 life or less anyways, and then on that on play synergizes very well with your leader effect to be able to utilize right away. And then especially in something like the Ace matchup or many of these other matchups that we're going to talk about, Boa, right, we talked about earlier, having them pick back up at 5 cost or less and then playing down maybe something with 4 or less from their hand can actually be quite good, right? Especially in something like the Ace matchup, being able to bounce back a Yamato and then them not being able to play anything else back down can be so good, right? Especially if you can catch your opponent off guard a little bit to where you can put a character back in their hand and they actually can't play anything down, at least anything impactful anyways. We also saw in this version EB03 Otama, which is a Land of Wano 2K. You play this Otama, right, because of that activate main where you can rest one of your opponent's Dawn cards or Smiler animal types, you know, if they have any blockers or any important Smiler animal characters. I think it's mostly used for the Dawn card, especially because with your leader effect, you can go ahead right away and pick up that Otama, right? It's basically a pay 2 to rest one of your opponent's Dawn and an easy way to get leader effect off. I think this version is very interesting and I'd highly encourage that some of you in OP13 right now trying to play this deck maybe think about including Portgasti Ace, because even though this is pretty much the worst of the 3 secret rares in the set, I do think it has some viability within this deck. Okay, let's talk about some of the new decks. First off with Doflamingo. I think Doflamingo had an incredible weekend, right? So much so that I think I'd move it up from my initial feelings on the tier list up 1 tier. Not only getting second placed in the first Japan championship that we saw in Tokyo, but having a handful of other tops throughout the weekend. Being able to redirect attacks is so nice within this deck, especially when you have great targets like the Sugar to play out another 5 cost on the field, like Baby 5 to be able to heal a life card, which we saw in some of the stream games in that first Tokyo championship were so good actually. And then also another great target in Dellinger, right, being another searcher within this deck. Oh yeah, and then Monet as well, right? Draw 2, trash 1, and then ramp 2 Dawn. One thing that we saw across the weekend in general is a lot more people playing Divine Departure. Now, I feel like a lot of people weren't really talking about Divine Departure heading into this past championship weekend, but was actually so good in some of these decks like Doflamingo, right? Being able to minus 8,000 power character can give you so much power in terms of board control, especially when you've got stuff like leader swing incoming, stuff like a 9,000 power Doflamingo swing. Heck, you can even swing with some of the stuff like Sugar on the field, especially if they're a 9,000 power or lower character originally. Slow Beam Sword also just being a very great card in this deck, being able to rest one of your opponent's characters for just a Dawn -1, and you have the ability as well to redirect an attack. It's such kind of like a tanky deck in the end game, right? You have so much potential to be able to starve off attacks and survive. I was super impressed by how Doflamingo ran within this weekend, and there's a couple different builds and certain aspects that you can do, like some people play less Usohachi, this list running 3, some people play more of this Baby 5, because, well, it's searchable. Some people even play the 2K Monet, right, as a bigger body that you can potentially play onto the field if times are tough. I think it'll be really curious to see how Doflamingo does as this format continues on, because I've seen a lot of people as well talk about how they actually think after this weekend that Doflamingo is the strongest OP14 leader, which I don't know if I'm ready to say it's stronger than Dracule Mihawk, but I will say this was definitely a first great step in trying to convince me of that point. Now, you might be saying that, Jake, we were super unimpressed in the Tokyo Championships that happened this past weekend with Dracule Mihawk. Do you really think it's the best deck? And let me tell you that Dracule Mihawk actually won the Hong Kong 1v1 championship, this being the list. The biggest thing that I want to talk about with this, there are 2 points. First of all, I have seen multiple topping lists playing We Are, one of the music events from EBO2 that a lot of people thought would break the game when it released. Quickly became realized when it released that no, these cards aren't actually good in like really any decks, to now a deck like Dracule Mihawk playing it, at least in the beginning of the format, right? Being able to find a cost 4 or more character now officially means that you have searches for not only Perona, which most all lists are running, right? We already talked about how good this card can be, but your other package in Bonnie and also Bonnie, right? One thing that really surprised me this past weekend is that just about every single Dracule Mihawk list was running at least one copy of the Blocker Jewelry Bonnie, Secret Rare, and at least one copy of the Stun Bonnie from OP07. And honestly, it kind of makes sense, right? Being able to naturally draw cards and filter out your hand to find different kinds of pieces, especially when you have a ton of rested cards, can be very, very nice. But also just being able to stun one of the Dawn, as I've mentioned previously in different videos, or a character can actually be super solid in a couple different matchups, right? Especially because Perona can just play a 5-cost green card from your hand, which could be a Tashigi, which could be the Bonnies. There's many different things with this, but also We Are actually also finds Doflamingo 10-drop. It's not always a full 4 copies or anything like that, but I have seen multiple lists that top from this past weekend actually play this card in at least 1 or 2 copies, right? Just like in Bonnie, being able to freeze 3 characters on the field or leader is so good for trying to stall out a game plan, right? Especially if you don't need to be on the more proactive side of resting stuff like Law and Beppo, which most all lists running 3 or 4 of these, by the way, like I mentioned earlier. Especially because we'll a lot of times see with Dracule Mihawk when the coffin boat is not set up at the beginning of the game, we'll actively rest our own characters, and especially with a 10,000 power body that you're playing on the field, that's a pretty easy rest because you'll probably be able to counter out anyways on it. And then, by the way, if you rested from your leader effect, you get to restand 3 Dawn to utilize for different bigger swings. Although Dracule Mihawk may not have had the best appearance in the Japan Championships, it is still a good and threatening deck that I think a lot of people are going to have to look out for. Also, I want to say this list playing a couple copies of Raizo. Raizo, honestly, with a pretty decent effect, this OP01 card, when attacking once per turn, if you have 2 or more rested characters, draw 1 card, especially because you can proactively rest your own characters. And if you had any on the board, you're probably going to swing with them. Anyways, this guy's a really nice way to just be able to refresh the hand, especially because I believe that on the check, similar to the limb cards, right, he counts himself as a rested character. Correct me if I'm wrong if that's not correct, but I'm pretty sure he'll count himself. So you really only need 1 other character on the field to be rested, which can be done by your leader effect. So pretty much if you play this on curve on 3, when you go on 5, if you play out a 5-cost character, you're always going to draw with this card on the first set of attacks. We also saw some Jimbes within the top 16 of this championship weekend, and although not making it very far and not streamed, the top list that I found was a Warlord version that made the top 8 of one of the Japan Championships. Right, we talked a lot about the Fishman version, which if you want to see that, go check out one of the other videos that I've made in OP14. But with Sengoku, right, being able to be a 7 Warlords of the Seas searcher and having several Warlord kind of cards already, like the 8-cost Jimbe, the Perfume Femur, etc. We've slotted in a couple other Warlords cards, as you can see, right? Trafalgar Law, just being a 1-drop chum blocker on the field. Buggy being a nice 2K to rearrange your deck. Another 2K in Trafalgar Law, right? If you play it down, you can utilize that active main to be able to have your opponent bottom deck a card, right? Very similar to something like the Arlong, right? The promo Arlong that got people raving and bought out or whatever. I actually think this card is better because you don't have to attack with it. It's not only a searchable 2K, but you can also just play down, put it back into the hand, use it as a 2K. And then the Trafalgar Law from Starter Deck 17. This may give some of you nightmares, but this Trafalgar Law can be pretty good, especially if the early stages of the game you play down something like Buggy to rearrange your hand and be able to find key pieces within the deck. Trafalgar Law is just really nice for 4-cost removal, which could be pretty good in the Boa matchup, with the Doflamingo matchup, and even some ace cards like Marco. Other than that, though, a lot of stuff is as we've predicted, right, with the Fishman package of Arlong, Hotchan, a couple copies of Chew, Koala, Fisher, Tiger just being such a good card, and Jozu just being a really good removal card, right? Especially since Emu back down on the decline, as I mentioned. Now, although we didn't see Crocodile streamed in the Tokyo Championships, we did see one make within the top 16 and another within the top 32. I didn't find the top 16 list, but I did find this list that did make top 32 in the championship, having an 8-1 record. So honestly, just bubbled out of top 16 cut. Still a very valid deck list. And one thing that I've noticed most about this deck is the 2 copies of Mr. 5, right? A lot of people at the beginning of the week, even before the set even released, we're playing a full 4 copies of the Mr. 5, right? And is a good card in general because, well, you can draw 2, trash 1. A great filter card. But playing many more copies of something like Miss Doublefinger, being able to give all of your characters +2 cost can be good against some removal type matchups, right? Especially stuff like Mr. 5. Play this out on the field and you've got this Miss Doublefinger continuous effect off, that means that something like Jozu in the ace matchup is not going to be able to remove it. It makes a lot of these characters, right, especially the 5-and-ups, out of ranges that your opponent really wants to hit. And then the stun lock Crocodile, I mean, this guy is so good if you can get him on the field and you're not facing like a Red Rock kind of deck. Being able to stun 2 characters on the turn that it's played is just so good, right? And even having a pseudo hand filtering effect, being able to draw cards on the on play and trash a card on that on KO, which you probably used on your leader effect. It just gives it such a cool loop. And the addition, as I've mentioned on the channel, I believe, the Haute Couture Patchwork, especially when you have a leader effect that minuses 10 to the board, the Patchwork is so nice to be able to just force anything really on the field to not be able to attack. I definitely expect that we'll see a Crocodile in a top cut in the future. And although maybe it might not be in the #1 spot of the new OP14 leaders, it's still a very good and viable deck that I would expect to see in the future. For the final deck list that I'm going to talk about real quick, I'm going to talk about this red-green Luffy, which actually made top 32 in one of the Japan championships. I think having a 7-2 record, so bubbled in on the X and 2s. In OP14, we talked about in our set review how this Nami is super good within this deck, right? And especially with players slotting in a couple copies of this card, it definitely has proven to be a good card in this deck, right? Being able to rest 2 8 costs up to 2 8 costs and then setting up 5 Dawn cards as active on a 4 Dawn play can just be so nice, not only for setting up endgame and lethal territories, but also just your leader effect in general. We also saw red-green Luffy players playing a couple copies of this Usopp, which I thought was fine. I didn't know if it was worth sliding into these different decks, but especially at that end of turn, right, setting up 2 Dawn cards as active, we've seen this player completely take out Zoro right from OP12, especially on that on play restanding to Dawn. Now saying, okay, maybe on 4 Dawn, it's just a little bit more valuable to get this Usopp down to where every single end of turn, you'll be able to restand 2 Dawn as active, so long as you keep this guy on the field. We also saw a single copy of this Vivy, which I thought was pretty interesting, especially with not too many like Alabasta type cards. I would have maybe slotted in the 1-cost Nami instead. I kind of feel like I see what they're trying to do, but it being your only Alabasta card, it's just searching for Straw Hat Crews, so why not just search one more card? Maybe, no, it still doesn't make sense, because, like, this can't find Vivy. I don't really know. But this Robin also putting in a lot of work in this red-green Luffy deck. If your Straw Hat Crew character would be removed from the field by your opponent's effects, rest one of your Dawn cards instead. Perfect for this leader, right? Being able to leave so much Dawn as active in a single turn. We also saw a couple copies of the double attack Luffy and also the 9-cost Zoro, but this player also playing several copies of 9-cost Shanks, which I thought was pretty interesting in this deck. It is technically searchable because of your Garp, right? Because you're a Luffy leader, but something I feel like we haven't seen too often. I feel like the boss monsters just really consist of like the 9-cost Zoro and maybe the 6-cost Luffy, and that's been pretty much it. But like I talked about with the Emu trending downwards a little bit and not as populous within the tournament, Shanks becomes a little bit more viable, just being able to KO any rested character on the field regardless of cost or power. And he's also an 11,000 power body to establish. And that's it. Again, you can check out the website where I upload all these events on Eggman's listing, especially because there were so many other decks that got inputted that weren't at the championships, like GP Luffy is in here, right? I've started uploading some other things like this Sanji right at this flagship, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe for more, and let me know what you're excited about in OP14.